Labour, so they are down 7 points since June, which is truly dreadful for an Anas Sarwar, no matter how you look at it. But the other one, the one I want to talk about first, is Reform are up 4 points. But also in June, IPSOS asked voters what their top 10 priorities were ahead of the election. Immigration wasn't even mentioned, is now coming in at the third most mentioned. Now, that's, I said to you before we recorded this, Smitty, that's probably because if you are a Reform voter, you will tell pollsters your number one issue is immigration. And that's shot up the rankings, so to speak. So I guess it's the obvious question is, are Reform going to continue to rise in the polls, and is there any way back for Labour?
Well, I think if you'd asked me this 2 weeks ago, I would have said the Reform, I think Reform's biggest problem is still going to be getting its people out to vote, because I think it's attracting the type of people who maybe don't normally vote, who felt disengaged from politics. And I would have said that once focus turns on the SNP's record in government, then I think Labour will, have some sort of fight back. Now I'm really not so sure, because this is such a devastating result for them. I mean, it's just awful, no matter how much you try and dress it up. I would say I sometimes feel IPSOS. I had a wee look back. I know you said that we don't get as much polling here, but I had a wee look back on previous polls, and IPSOS can be a bit of an outlier with stuff like the Green. I noticed the Greens in the regional vote got 17%.
Could double the number of MSPs.
Now, no one else is getting them anywhere close to that, apart from Find Out Now.
No, the less that they would find out now, the better.
But no one else is getting close to that. So there might be maybe it's inflating the Green vote. Is it also inflating the Reform vote? These kind of outsider parties. I don't know, but there's no way you can dress it up.
Politics is about momentum, and Reforms seem to have momentum. Obviously ignoring they have momentum UK wide, but in Scotland they do seem to have some momentum, whereas Labour in Scotland, it's been said here many times before, are paying the price because a lot of voters up here have decided that they don't like your style of government.
I mean, by May next year, Scotland could be the most Reform area of the UK in terms of elected representation. Immigration, I know what you're saying about it's very much Reform voters who are driving that. Immigration is now a bigger priority than the Constitution. We've been talking about independence and that kind of thing. It's now a bigger issue in voters' minds. They seem to be in charge of the narrative in Scotland, Reform at the moment. John Swinney's anti-far right summits really had the desired effect. Although maybe it has had the desired effect from his point of view, because
they consolidated their vote. I mean, just on that. I mean, we talked earlier in this episode about Swinney and Scotland's Energy, but he also obviously took questions from journalists. There was a woman from Sky News, I forget her name, but she asked a very pertinent question about what the First Minister thought about the rise of Reform in Scotland. And John Swinney made a very robust defence. He said, "I'm not going to change my views." He said, "I think protests outside hotels, temporarily housing asylum seekers are appalling." He's basically just reminding SNP voters, we have a very clear view of immigration that is the polar opposite to Reform. They're talking about a core vote strategy.
Well, that's what his set piece on Monday was. It's a core vote strategy.
Swinney's playing a dangerous game there by in opposing Reform and making Reform the focus of a lot of his attention. He's talking them up, and I think Reform have benefited from their UK-wide surge because obviously immigration has become such a keystone issue. But there's no doubt they've been talked up in Scotland by John Swinney, I think, because he's put them right to the heart of most of the things he's said. And it's deliberate, it's on purpose, because he wants this to be an election between Scottish nationalism and British nationalism, or Little England nationalism on the Reform side. And if he can present himself as the flag waver for Scotland, then he thinks he'll pick up a lot of votes. And he wants this election to be an identity politics battle between him and Farage. And Labour, unfortunately, is caught in that squeeze, because it's wanting this election to be about services, about the NHS, about schools, and it cannot get its message across because it's being drowned out. And I feel sorry for Anas Sarwar. I don't think he's put a foot wrong. I think he's said the right things. He's got prescriptions for problems that Scotland is facing, proper problems, no the made up problem of immigration. and he's being squeezed out of the debate by Swinney and Farage. You know, they're two cheeks of the same arse.
Just on that, I mean, looking at this poll by Ipsos talking about voter priorities, almost 60% of voters said that the state of the health service is their number one priority. Now, we all know that the health service in Scotland and in the rest of the UK has big challenges, but about a third of voters in Scotland still say the SNP are best placed to lead it, which is despite, you know, every single week at First Minister's Questions. Now, I know that not everyone's tuning in to that as much as I do, but every week, you know, you hear terrible examples of patients have been let down and staff facing burnout and examples of the real problems the health service faces. But a third of voters still say, well, it's tough, but the SNP are best placed to handle it.